The Blood Legion Char returned with Riona within the hour. She was battered and bruised, but the Char followed the Tribune's orders to the letter. She was whole, and her eyes blazed with anger. The Char brought her before Ember, and the two locked eyes for a moment. Then Ember pulled back and lashed out with a wicked backhand slap. It caught Riona on her chin, and she collapsed to her knees from the force of the blow. "Chain her up," snarled Ember, pointing at Cranks and Gullick, "and do it right this time, or I'll stake you out for the Ravens." The Char who had captured Riona nodded with approval and told Ember how they'd found her, crouched in a shallow cave. She had no weapons, and had surrendered. Gullick and Cranks reattached the chains. "She had to do that, you know," said Gullick softly. "She cannot show weakness." Riona glowered. "That's not what I'm mad about. I lost the Char I was chasing. He got away." "Wait for later to tell her that," suggested Cranks. The company formed up, with Ember and her prisoners in the centre. No one but Ember was allowed to take control of the prisoners, but there was no way they could escape. Burning their dead with the tents of the Flame Legion, the company moved north, Ritlock Brimstone at its head. They moved at a double march speed, such that Cranks was scurrying to keep up. Behind them curled the smoke from the burning tents, and having advertised their presence, Ritlock had no intention of remaining in the area. Dougal could feel the sweat of exertion and fear run down his back. They were surrounded by Char, and he felt like a mouse among cats. The urge to bolt, to flee, was strong, and he was afraid that it would overmatch his better judgment. He looked at Riona and saw that she was staring ahead, the welt from Ember's strike still vivid on her face. She noticed Dougal looking at her and nodded. At the next rest break in the march, she leaned toward him. "This commander is a slave driver," she said. "Ember said that the commander is Ritlock Brimstone," replied Dougal. "She's afraid of him. I don't blame her." "Do you know about this Ritlock?" said Riona. "Big-time Char hero?" said Dougal, and one or two Char soldiers glanced toward them. He shut up until they looked away. "He was one of Destiny's Edge, legendary adventurers. Captain Logan Thackeray was one of that group, along with the Asura Snaff, the Silvari Kaith, and the Norn heir." "Heirs to Gulkin," said Gullick sternly. "She was a great hero. Once." He stressed the word was. "So the slave driver hung out with us mere humans?" "Pitiful," said Riona, loud enough for a few Char heads to twist in her direction. "The prisoner will be silent," snapped Cranks, and slapped Riona's haunch with the lightning rod. Dougal admired that Riona didn't strike out against the Asura. They marched through the heat of the day, reaching the base camp by the late afternoon. The beachside camp was on the shores of the lake dominating the Ascalon basin, and was laid out with military precision, lines of tents arranged in grids. The troops were dismissed and returned to their assigned quarters, leaving Ember and her prisoners alone. The Char stood there, waiting, and within a few moments the black-furred Tribune stormed up. "Doomforge!" snapped Ritlock Brimstone. "Sir, yes, sir," said Ember, snapping to attention. Riona stifled a laugh, and Dougal scowled at her. "You are a mystery. I don't like mysteries in my camp," Brimstone snarled. "You will take the furthest tent, down by the shore." "Yes, sir." Ember looked petrified. Brimstone ignored her discomfort. "There is an empty supply skiff moored there. We are going to abandon it and report it scuttled. I want you out of here before tomorrow morning. We are headed east along the coast. Choose a different direction." "Understood, sir." "Understand this," said Brimstone. "I don't want to see your face again." "Dismissed." Ember executed a crisp salute and said, "Yes, sir." She motioned to Gullick to pull the humans down toward the far end of the tents. "And Doomforge," said Ritlock Brimstone. "Yes, sir." "You have your grandmother's eyes," said the Tribune, and managed what Dougal could only imagine was a smile. "Thank you, sir," said Ember, suddenly relaxing a fraction of an inch, and waving for the others to follow. The selected tent had been newly erected a fair distance from the crisp lines and close to the abandoned skiff. Ember indicated to the others to step inside. "Get your rest. We'll leave once night has settled." He knows, said Cranks, pulling off his rumpled hat and running his fingers through his hair. He knows what we're doing. No, replied Ember. That is, he knows I'm up to something, and that Imperator Swordshadow is somehow involved, and that we are a mystery, and he hates mysteries. The sooner we sneak out, the sooner he will be relieved of thinking about what we're up to. And what did he mean about your grandmother's eyes? Said Riona. I thought it was obvious, said Ember, pushing at the entrance to the tent. He knows my grandmother. You rest. You will need your energy. And then she was gone, leaving the others to make themselves comfortable as they saw fit. Dougal did not remove his chains, and Riona did not request it. They rested until dark. For an abandoned skiff scheduled for scuttling, the boat proved to be well stocked. A pair of heavy oars were set in muffled locks near the stern, and a long steering pole was laid alongside a gunwale. Beneath the seats were a few tins of boiled meat. The Asura took the bow, the humans and Ember behind him. Gullick pushed off from the shore and, nimbly for his size, settled in at the rowing bench. They rowed away from the camp on quiet oars. No one would admit to seeing them leave. Once they were far enough from the shore that the char campfires were hot, red dots, Ember unlocked the manacles. Dougal wanted to throw them into the lake, but instead handed them over to Gullick, who paused from his rowing long enough to stash them back in his satchel and return Riona's and Dougal's weapons to them. The moon was already up when they left the camp, but the lake swallowed its light utterly. They rowed through the darkness, the horizon only obvious from where the stars ended and complete blackness began. Far to the north, there was a faint glow, something throwing the moonlight back into the sky. Riona and Dougal took turns at the bow of the boat, with the pole, feeling in the darkness for the bottom and moving aside logs and lakeweed in their path. There was a splashing off the port side, but when Dougal turned, all he could see was a flash of silver scales diving. There was another light up ahead, this one the colour of flames. As they closed, it resolved into 2, then 4, then a dozen different fires, all contained within great iron foundries. Iron Dock, said Ember, identifying the place. It is one of our weapons foundries. It runs all day and night. Hang to the far bank. Gullick proved to be a subtle and deft rower, and moved the shallow drafted skiff to the left side of the lake and through a narrow passage. Now they could hear the clanging of anvils and the roar of forges across the water, combined with the snarling shouts of the overseers. The lake narrowed, and they could see the docks, metal-shod boats bobbing up at the quay. Then Gullick passed them as well, and they were around a rock outcropping, and turned back toward the north. You are making weapons, said Riona quietly. Aye, said Ember. Even if there is peace with the humans and Ebonhawk, the Legion have no end of enemies. Ghosts, Flame Legion, Ogres Grawl. And dragons, added Dougal. And dragons, agreed Ember, although in the darkness, Dougal could not see the look on the Char's face. Now the glow to the north resolved itself more clearly. It was not a reflection of the racing moon, but a brilliant radiance with its own source. As they cleared the channel and the terrain opened to the north, Dougal could see it more fully, and recognised it. It was a single ray of brilliant white light, reaching to the heavens, raised like a sword over the northern darkness, and like a blade it cut Dougal to the heart, for at its base was the centre of the foe fire. In its distant light, Dougal could see the faces of the others. Ember was familiar with the sight, and was unimpressed, but Riona and Cranks stared at the beacon on the horizon. Even Gullick, reliable rower he had been, stopped his labours and stared at it, open-mouthed, before recovering himself and resuming his regular strokes. The lake was shallower now, and Dougal was touching bottom with his pole more often than not. Trees started to appear at the shores, long-limbed mangroves fluttering with bats and night swallows. Finally, the water became marsh, which became land solid enough to walk upon. Ember pointed to an outcropping on the northern shore, and Gullick pulled the boat up on the thick mud. Ember started up the bank, and the others followed, although Dougal now knew the land well. The northern horizon had changed, limned by the power of the faux fire's heart. It was now an irregular shadow, angular and blocky. The remains of Ascalon city itself. At the top of the bank was a broad road, and after waiting a few moments the group skittered across it, avoiding any Char patrols. Only when they were on the northern side of the road did Ember react and make for one of the low hills overlooking the city in shadows. They climbed to the top, where they came upon a petrified remains of several great poles that had stood, undisturbed, for 2 centuries. "The viewing hill," said Dougal, knowing it from the tale. "This was where Fireburn watched the faux fire." "Yes," said Ember, "and here I complete my task, and my knowledge fails me. We are going to need your knowledge of the city come morning." "And until dawn?" asked Dougal. "We wait," said the Char. They were close enough to the city now that there was little danger of Char patrols, but still beyond the city walls, and there was little risk of ghosts. Dougal could see the spires of the broken towers of the city, dimly lit by the brilliance of the faux fire. It looked like a ghost city, the perfect home for the dead. About an hour after they arrived, a bank of clouds moved in from the west, capturing the moon and overtaking the skyblade of the faux fire. The light from the heart of the curse splashed against the bottom of the clouds. Now that they stood on the edge of the city, the group was uneasy. Rest would be good, but this close, none were in the mood. Ember prowled the perimeter, watchful for Char patrols. Cranks fiddled with things in his pack. Gullick sat on the southern end of the hill, facing away from the city itself, looking out over the roads and lake to the south. Only Riona seemed willing to rest, but she was seated, her helmet and sword laid to one side, as if she were waiting for something. As for Dougal, he tried to relax, looking up at the pattern the faux fire's beacon made across the sky. But at last he had to give up, and sat up, looking at the city's crumbling edifices. Cranks cleared his throat. "You still have that ambient thermatargic construct?" the Asura asked. "The golem's eye?" Dougal nodded. "Can I see it?" Cranks said. Dougal fished the stone from his pocket, and gazed at it again. It was worth more than he might otherwise make in a year, but that did him little good at the moment. "Sure," he said, dropping it into the Asura's hands. "Just make sure you take care of it." "Oh," Crank said, "that I can promise you. I had to leave most of my tools back in Ebonhawk, but I brought a matrixulator. I could recalibrate it into a recharging device, given sufficient sympathetic energy." Dougal blinked at the Asura, realizing for the first time what Cranks had given up to come along. For most of the trip, he had thought the Asura was concerned with his own skin. Now it was clear he had left behind his lab and his projects, which, for an Asura, were as important as his life. "Why don't you hold on to it," said Dougal, "and see if you can figure it out." The Asura's eyes opened wide, and his long ears perked up. "Hang on," he said, and ran back to his pack, rooted around in it a bit, then came back with one of his bottles, a red syrup oozing down its sides. "Here, use this if you're injured. It's a good batch, I think." Dougal smiled, and put the untested potion in his pocket. "And if we don't find enough treasure in Ascalon City, that gem is yours. Buy yourself a new workshop." Cranks made a choking, gurgling noise, and pulled out a device that looked like the product of a union between a violin and a crossbow. Yes, you see, it is fully primed, but just needs some basic arcanic updates to handle the annual progression of the stars over the past 2 centuries. Dougal shook his head, understanding about 1 word in 3, which, when dealing with the Asura, was better than usual. He looked up and saw Gullick's broad back, his legs hanging over the southern-facing cliff. "If you'll excuse me," said Dougal, standing up. The Asura looked almost disappointed. "You don't want to hear me explain how it works?" Later, perhaps," Dougal said. "I owe Gullick a story." Dougal walked over to where Gullick was sitting, crossing paths with the patrolling Char. Ember just nodded at him and continued on her rounds. The human sat down next to the Norn, looked out over the quiet emptiness south of the city, and coughed softly. I first met Gyda, said Dougal, and noticed that Gullick flinched at the name. He started again. I first met Gyda Odsotter in a second-story room in a tavern in Divinity's Reach. We had both been hired by a Clag, who you've met. And let me say that Clag was the type of Asura who would only be brave if he was backed up by a large golem or a Norn. Clag had both, and the Norn was your powerful cousin, so you can imagine he was insufferable. Gullick let out a chuckle, and Dougal continued. He spoke of their adventures beneath Divinity's Reach, of finding Blim's tomb, and of the final battle with the skeletal tomb guardian. He did not mention Gyda's bullying or threats, and once or twice, when he spoke of her kind nature, Gullick gave him a sideways glance and a smile. For the most part, he told the truth, but it was the truth you would speak about the dead for the benefit of the living. When he had finished, Gullick clapped Dougal on the shoulder. By that time, the sky was lightening to the east, although its rise would be obscured by the gathering clouds. It would be an overcast and grey day in the dead city. The slow, colourless dawn revealed a city of tombstones. Its outer walls were broken apart like a jumble of loose teeth, and its spires and structures were canted, their windows and doors shattered and empty. Dougal could make out the sights from his map and his earlier visit. There was the sunrise tower of the palace, its spire rising above all others. The royal treasury was within the palace complex. There had been a central tower, but that had fallen, taking King Adalbern and his curse with it. There was the Hall of Records, now roofless, its contents rotted by time and weather, and there was the central plaza, where he had to shoot Jervis. His heart sank at the sight. The others came up behind him, but for the longest moment, no one spoke. It's a wreck, Riona said. A horrible, terrible ruin. I knew the stories, of course, but I never. It's worse on the inside, said Dougal. So, Ember said, looking to Dougal, what is our plan of attack? Dougal turned to look at the other four. All were armed and waiting for him. There was no question of turning back now, even if they wanted to. They had paid too high a price to get this far. This way, said Dougal, although, as he spoke, he felt he was condemning all of them to their deaths. Dougal led the others down to the city's crumbling outer wall and followed it around to the right, away from the gaping maw of the main gates. This is how we entered last time, he said. And we all know how well that went, said Cranks. Why don't we march in through the front gates? Said Gullick. Every ghost in the city would come to meet us, Dougal said. They're mostly mindless monsters, but they remember being charged with protecting that gate, and then watching it fall. They have watchers there. Nothing and no one ever gets through it. He pointed to a hole in the collapsed wall, wide enough for even Gullick to fit through. Besides, he said, I've been this way before, so I know what to expect. Riona looked at the wreckage of stone and mortar around her. I never imagined it would be this bad. Steel yourself, then, Dougal said as he climbed over several feet of rubble to reach the back of an alley on the wall's other side. There are worse things in here than ghosts. There's bones, Gullick said. What could be worse than an army of ghosts? Dougal led the team to the mouth of the alley, which opened up on a wide street that had once been a centre of commerce in the city. As he reached the street, Dougal stepped back and waved his arms to present the scene to the others. What's worse? He said. All the bodies from which they came. The bones, armour, and weapons of the soldiers that had been fighting at the time of the foe fire littered the streets. Most of the skeletons lay there still intact, having had to endure only a couple of centuries of weather and sun. Unlike on other battlefields, birds and other animals refused to pick at the flesh here, the ghosts and the foe fire itself keeping them far away. The first bodies lay at the mouth of the alley, and as Gullick brushed past one of them, it fell to pieces. The bones clattered, and the armour clanged on the cobblestones, startling them all. Gullick cursed his clumsiness, then withdrew behind Dougal again. Nothing is holding these bodies together but memories, said Riona. Those memories are fading fast, said Dougal. He pointed at a small square that the street opened onto. That's the way we're headed. And where are we going? Asked Ember. Ultimately, to the royal treasury, beneath the palace. Finding a way down once we reach it is another challenge. When Adalbern set off the faux fire, the buildings were shifted, and some of the lower stories were crushed by the upper. The king's chamber, atop the Sunrise Tower, was mostly unscathed. It should have some access. You say should like you do not know, said Cranks. We never got that far, said Dougal. But then we broke into the city at night. Dougal crept up on the street slowly, picking his way past the bodies and struggling to find a path that was wide enough that he could reasonably expect Gullick to be able to navigate it. Although Dougal was certain he'd given the Norn plenty of room, Gullick still bumped over an occasional body, sending bones, weapons, and armour clattering along the cobblestones. Dougal hoped that the ghosts would not be as active now, with the sun still on the rise, as they might be at night. Due to the city's high walls and surrounding buildings, though, shadows would hold on to the night long into the day. And despite the fact that they had previously encountered the ghosts at night, it did not mean they were afraid of the day, or any less lethal. Soon, they reached the street that led to the main square. As they drew closer, Dougal grew more and more tense. At one point, he noticed he was unconsciously holding his breath. He had to force himself to breathe. It was then that he realised where he was. Intentionally or not, he had brought the others to the very place where he had last seen Vala and Dak alive. He had struggled so hard to blot it from his memories that he didn't recognise it at first. But when he saw a familiar set of armour lying on the street in the centre of a large bloodstain that the years had not done enough to fade, it all came flooding back to him. He knelt down next to the skeleton that had once been his friend, and he reached out to touch the front of the helmet it still wore. Dak Turnbull, he said. How did it all go so wrong? Riona came up behind him and put a hand on his shoulder. Is it really him? The pain on her face made her look much older. Dougal stood up and found himself in Riona's embrace. It's all right, she said. Finishing the job here will make it all right. Then she stopped, and Dougal felt Riona's breath catch in her chest at something she saw over his shoulder. Oh no, she whispered in his ear. She might have said something else, but Dougal couldn't hear it. The sound of someone shouting from up the street drowned her out. Alarm! Alarm! An ethereal, strident voice cried. The walls have been breached. Invaders are in Ascalon City. Alarm! Alarm!